one piece of news that I think we definitely should get to also that has been making the rounds recently is about the sort of update on Malcolm's assassination that people have been talking about. If folks don't know, two of the people of the three people who were originally convicted of Malcolm X's assassination, who I think there's always been doubts for at least 53 years on the actual involvement of two of those convicted of it. Those folks are now going to have their convictions thrown out. And we're talking about Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam, their Muslim names basically their Muslim names. So they're going to have their convictions thrown out. There's been, I think a lot of folks are trying to give the Netflix documentary credit for whatever the people think about in terms of this being some victory. But that happened, and that's good. And so those folks, one has already passed away. The other brother is like in his 80s and has been out for a while. But this is now some people are seeing this as some sort of progress, because at the very least, the state is acknowledging that there was a false prosecution that led to the conviction of these folks. But of course, the state is not admitting that the plot behind Malcolm's assassination was a plot directed by the state, which the Nation of Islam, which does hold some responsibility, were basically tools. And I will say, even though those two brothers were probably not directly linked to Malcolm's assassination, from talking to one of them before he passed, I shortly represented one of them. They were involved in terrorizing Malcolm in certain ways, and Malcolm's family. And so there's that too. And a shout out to someone put this in the chat, Carl Evans and Baba Kondo, who actually were the original folks, other than the who exposed not only in addition to the person who was actually convicted, who still remains convicted, of talking about that those folks who were convicted were not responsible. But other folks have been writing about this since the 90s and exposed who was actually involved in the Newark Mosque of the Nation of Islam, and who actually were probably the shooters. And then a Netflix documentary, which came out a year or so ago, tried to take credit for it, for the actual facts on the ground. So, yeah.
I want to make a slight correction on that. The two original folks was Peter Goldman, who was one of Malcolm's one of his biographers. He actually that's where the actual news article came from. He's an author. If you guys look him up, he put out 3 different editions. Him and Paul Lee are like the foremost authorities on Malcolm, period. And I actually was in communication with both of them yesterday, trying to get them on the show. And Peter Goldman's like 88 years old, but he's someone who was a friend of Malcolm. But not only that, he put out 3 different editions of the death and life of Malcolm. But he's the cat that really actually cracked the situation, because of the fact that he interviewed all these folks, and he was, researching, for decades, along with Paul Lee, who was one of the main people who a lot of these folks go to for information around Malcolm. But the situation is, you have the Netflix documentary, and you have a few other different things that was actually garbage in comparison to the actual research. But of course, for the sake of Hollywood and for the sake of smoothing things over and not ruffling too many feathers, oftentimes it's got to be watered down, and certain types of credit don't go to certain people. You know what I'm saying? Peter Goldman happens to be a white guy, of course. So, oftentimes you have narrow nationalists that want to, not give credit where credit is due, for lack of better words.
Let me ask you guys.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Come out. Because Kalonji, the question I had has to do with, like, why now? What was the point of the state even doing this now? The little that I know about the exoneration, I know part of it was based upon the deathbed confession of a NYPD detective who was part of this conspiracy. And his family has disputed the validity of that deathbed confession. Like, what? I'm just curious. Like, what? Why is this in the state's interest to revisit this now and to go forward with this exoneration? And not to say that they shouldn't have. They're doing the right thing now. Obviously, did the terrible thing 50 years ago, but this doesn't necessarily rectify anything, because I certainly haven't heard about any checks being cut to the brothers that have been exonerated or to their families.
I would say, I mean, and I think me and Kalaji might disagree slightly on Goldman's role. I think his first book, I think he did new editions of his first book based on new information, talking more about the actual assassination. I don't think he laid out the facts of the assassination. Maybe Paul Lee did. I know Kondo did. And later in the Judas book that Carl Evans did, he also laid out. And I think some of those folks laid out international aspects of the assassination. But I think partly the state's role in this is that the person who Bradley from Newark actually died a year or so ago. And that made it safe, because then they don't have to charge anybody, right? So they can say that, oh, look, we went back in time and we're saying that these people did not actually were there in the Audubon ballroom the day of the assassination, and said, therefore, that prosecution was an error. But they don't have to now necessarily charge the person who, again, several different historians, the ones that we mentioned, have already stated were the actual shooters, including, again, the shooter whose name, Kalaji, you may remember the guy, Thomas Hayer, who was at the scene, who's actually, through affidavits, admitted that those folks were not involved when he was represented by William Kunstler back in the late 60s and early 70s. So I think for the state, and Bradley might have had more information on the state's role in Malcolm's assassination. So I think all those things lead, and I think the pressure of the Netflix and getting more mainstream characters involved to have those folks look at it probably had something to do with it. But again, it's not like the state is acknowledging its own role in Malcolm's assassination. The fact that it wanted Malcolm dead, the fact that it infiltrated both the nation and Malcolm's organization of Afro-American Unity, the fact that it plotted to cause dissension within the nation and Malcolm, and the fact that they felt Malcolm was a threat to the racial order of the United States because of his work nationally and internationally. So none of those things change whatsoever. But the state now gets to say that, we're sorry for the bad thing that we did. Can we move on?
Right. And not only that, I mean, we have to look at the climate as well. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Part of propaganda and part of the state's mission is to cause confusion. You know what I mean? So the thing is, it's perfect timing right now. It is the quote unquote racial climate in America and internationally is at an all-time high. So the thing is, it's like, okay, what else can we pull out of our bag of tricks to cause confusion? Because
what do you mean by that, Kalanji? When you say that the racial climate is at an all-time high, what do you mean by that?
I mean, let's look at what's going on in America right now. The different, we have two major trials dealing with race right now. You know what I'm saying? Although the whole Rittenhouse situation, he shot white folks, but it was because of a situation with Jacob Blake, another black man who was murdered by shot by police. Then at the same time, here in the South, you have the situation going on with Ahmaud Arbery. You know what I'm saying? So it's just, it's one thing after another. It's one thing after another. The police shootings everywhere. You know what I mean? So everything is around, it's the quote unquote Black Lives Matter climate. You know what I mean? So right now, at one point you had Obama, which was on the whole post-racial America crap. You know what I mean? So everybody ran for that. We have a black president now. Whippy, yippee doo, hooray. You understand? Then you have Trump, who pretty much told you, nope, white is still right. You know what I'm saying? Cancel that black stuff. Good night. Then they said, okay, well, we're gonna get a bed wench. You know what I'm saying? To fill in as Biden's side chick. You know what I mean? To be the side chick of imperialism. To say that, look, well, we have a black face right now, and it happens to be a woman. So forget all her past atrocities, forget all of her railroading, so on and so forth. You got what you want. You have someone else that's black in office. But at the same time, in the streets, with these right wingers and these narrow nationalists and these fake leftists, you know, you have all types of. It's a circus going on right now. You know what I mean? A lot of the stuff that's happening right now in America couldn't pop off in any other country. It couldn't pop off in any other country because of the fact that there are, you know, just what we was talking about yesterday, like with the Kaepernick thing. You have so many activists and so on and so forth that's just out here, so you don't know which way to go. So right now, just any confusion, any propaganda that could be thrown in the mix to keep people on the other side of the track. Like, oh, no, let's not talk about this. They just exonerated these two men or whatever. Oh, yeah, well, you know, I think they killed them, whatever, so on and so forth. Most people that talk about Malcolm don't even do any research. It's just like you see the movies, you see the documentaries, you might have read a book, and that's it. I give props to folks like Paul Lee, who've dedicated his life work to this situation. You know what I'm saying? I give props to Peter Goldman, partially because of the fact that Paul himself says that there's no one out here that's going to give it to you in that way that has that particular proper information like that. That's according to him. That's not my words. You know what I mean? So
let me ask y'all a question. Like, what do y'all make of either these posthumous exonerations or, you know, clemency given to people, black people who were accused of crimes and hanged, either with a sham trial or no trial whatsoever, but 70, 100 years after the fact, oh, we're going to exonerate these poor black folks who were murdered for basically not doing anything or not adhering to what white people wanted them to do at the time, or being black in the wrong place, in the wrong space, etc. You know, 50 years after the fact, like I don't know how that. I'm just curious. Like this all seems like very self-serving motivations for the state to try to soften their own image and make themselves look good. I don't know how much these long-term, you know, 50 plus years exonerations, what does that do for our community? I'm venturing very little.
I think that becomes part of the problem, is that there's too many, including the guy who did the documentary on Netflix, who's kind of like, you know, taking credit because this exoneration has happened. But too many times we rely on these exonerations, or, you know, just I think there's another story recently about how someone who was convicted and they were released after 30 or 40 years in prison. And we see these as victories. We see when trying to push to see that Marcus Garvey mail fraud conviction gets overturned, or that Jack Johnson's conviction for bringing a white woman across state lines, that these convictions get overturned as if they do something valuable, as opposed to they become little speaking points for maybe people to feel better about the state apparatus, or to feel like they've gotten some justice. But you're talking 50, 60, 70, 80 years after the fact. So there's no justice won in that. The conditions don't change. And it's not like the tactics change, right? Letting our political prisoners out 40 or 50 years after them being railroaded into prison doesn't do anything necessarily for our movement. We're happy that they're out, but it's not necessarily, to me, a revolutionary radical victory in terms of claiming no lies, claiming no easy victories, telling no lies, right? I don't see that as some victory to uphold, right? And again, unless movement is happening that's making some of these things take place, for me, they are things that kind of keep us under the realm of watching what their court system does, how they so-called give out justice, and then our response to it is to have some of these middle class or civil rights leaders jump up and down and tell us how great it is that this stuff has happened, or how important it is that their system somehow holds us not guilty for something we should have been guilty in the first place. Like there's some validation in it, right? And so there's no validation in that for me. These are tactics and tools used by the state, which again may serve some smaller purposes, but they don't necessarily, for me, lead us to any closer to some victory, right? Because they're not movement victories.